And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello there, I'm meteorologist Peter Chan with your outlook for the marine weather coming up. We start with the surface map as of this Tuesday afternoon, weakening low over the lower Gulf. Winds will be coming down across the Gulf, light and variable at times as we go through midweek. There's a push of warmer air crossing the Bering Sea. This warm front will wash out but bring some light rain or rain showers to areas along the west coast later this Tuesday night and on Wednesday morning. And by the time we get into Wednesday afternoon, the low that was out over the lower Gulf will continue to sink further south into the North Pacific and weaken. The front pushing into the west side of the state will also have a tendency to weaken to a trough. And as far as any brisk winds, strongest winds we'll see here for marine weather interest coming up through midweek will be along areas of the especially western half of the Aleutians and maybe a little bit here across the southern half of the Alaska Peninsula. And into Thursday, still relatively quiet conditions across much of the Gulf Coast. And the only real action, if you can call it that, is trough along the west coast, trying to push up into the central portion of the Panhandle with another system way out to the west, west and southwest of the Aleutian chain. So ice, we're at that point in the summer season. It's just a slow melt off here across the far north and Arctic regions. Otherwise, plenty of open water from the Chukchi Sea down through the Bering Strait. Areas of the Panhandle on Wednesday, winds for the inner channels will be southerly 10 to 15 knots with waves running just a couple of feet. Along the outer coast, nearshore forecast within 15 nautical miles from coastal areas there. Look for southeast winds to easterly winds, especially south of Yakutat down to offshore of Sitka and Craig. Generally 15 knots and waves running 3-4 feet. On Thursday, the inner channels, especially Stevens Passage on up through Lynn Canal, variable winds only around 5 knots, waves a foot or two, maybe southeast winds 10 knots there, Dixon Entrance and down along areas of Ketchikan and Metlakatla. Otherwise, on the outer coast, look for northwest to north winds around 10 knots and waves generally running 2-3 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, winds initially will be out of the east-northeast at 10 to 15 knots, waves within Prince William Sound a couple of feet. But out across areas of Cook Inlet, the winds will have some sort of southerly component, 15 to maybe as high as 20 knots as you get north of Anchor Point on up into the upper portion of Cook Inlet with waves running 4 to 5 feet. And winds will come down along the northwestern Gulf, variable winds around 10 knots for Thursday, with waves 2 to 3 feet. Westerly winds within Prince William Sound, waves 2 feet there. And for middle upper Cook Inlet, look for southwest winds around 10 knots, waves a foot or two, and variable winds around the entrance of Cook Inlet at 10 knots and waves running a couple of feet. Across Kodiak Island, strongest winds through Shelikof Strait around 20 knots. And as we go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula, winds will be west to northwest, 20 knots on the North Pacific side, 15 to 20 knots on the Bering side with waves running 2 to 3 feet. For Thursday, variable winds only around 10 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island with waves there running a couple of feet. Look for the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula, north of Cold Bay, southwest winds, about 20 knots with waves running 4 to 6 feet there, and waves only running generally a couple of feet on the North Pacific side of the peninsula. Winds across the Aleutian chain on Wednesday will be west-northwest across the eastern Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots generally speaking. As we head further west, winds will go southwest to south, increasing to 30 knots west of Adak, with waves west of Adak building anywhere from 8 to as high as 12 feet. And on Thursday, generally across the Aleutian chain, look for south-southwest winds around 20 to 25 knots, waves running anywhere from 4 to as high as 8 feet there in the western Aleutians on the Bering side, and generally in the, say, 4 to 7 foot range on the North Pacific side, though a little higher once you get west of Adak, perhaps as much as 8 or 9 feet. Along the southwest coast and up through the lower Yukon Delta, winds will be southwest 10 to 15 knots or so, waves running a couple of feet. West winds as high as 20 to 25 knots there from St. Paul on up towards St. Matthew with waves of 7 to as high as 9 feet. On Thursday, look for south winds of 15 knots into Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay with waves generally 2-3 feet. Southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, St. Matthew down through St. Paul with waves around 8 feet. And then off of the Yukon Delta and on up into Norton Sound, we expect south to southeast winds around 15 knots with waves of 2 to 3 feet. And finally, as we go into the far north along the Arctic coast, winds will generally be out of the east at 15 knots with waves a foot or two where there is some open water. As we go down through the Chukchi Sea, strongest winds will be through the lower Chukchi Sea. There is open water through this area, and we expect winds as high as 20 to 25 knots from the Bering Strait up through the lower Chukchi Sea with waves running 4 to 5 feet. And then on Thursday, winds continue from the east along the Arctic coast, 10 to 15 knots with waves 1 to maybe as much as 2 to 3 feet in the vicinity of Kaktovik. Otherwise, southeasterly winds across the lower Chukchi Sea near 15 knots with waves 2 to 3 feet, but could be as high as 5 feet once you get off of Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, and areas of Norton Sound on up to south of the Bering Strait. Winds will be southeast to south around 10 to 15 knots and waves generally running 2 to maybe as high as 3 feet. So there's your marine weather, and if you are able to venture out, have a safe time.